Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. How does a simple, incorrect $2,500 HOA bill lead to the board president resigning in disgrace and a $58,000 payout to an entire street? It all started when my HOA tried to charge me for their pool, forgetting that I have my own. But they also forgot that I keep receipts. And I read every single word of the fine print. I want to start by saying I am not a confrontational person. I do not enjoy drama. I have never once gone looking for a fight with anyone in my neighborhood, and for the first 4 years of living in my house, I had what I considered a perfectly fine, boring, uneventful relationship with the HOA. I paid my dues on time, I kept my yard clean, I didn't park on the street overnight, I was by any measure a model resident, and then they tried to charge me $2,500 for a pool I have never set foot in. Let me back up. The neighborhood I live in is one of those developments that got built in stages over about 15 years. The original section went up first and has all the big amenities, the resort-style pool, the clubhouse, the fitness center. That section was organized under what the founding documents call the Phase 1 Amenities Group. A few years later, a second developer came in and built a row of homes on a street that hooks off the back of the main neighborhood, my street. That section was organized separately under something called the Phase 2 Landscaping Oversight Committee. We paid dues for landscaping maintenance of the common green spaces on our specific street. Grass, irrigation, the little planted medians at the entrance, that's it. We have always paid a slightly lower rate than the Phase 1 residents because we don't have access to their amenities. This was not a secret. It was in the deed. It was in the Master Declaration of Covenants. It was in every single document I signed at closing. I am not an attorney. I work in insurance, which means I spend a significant portion of my professional life reading documents that most people would rather set on fire than actually look at. When I bought my house, I read everything, every page, and I made copies of everything, organized in a binder I keep in my home office. My wife has made fun of this binder more than once. She calls it my house Bible. I call it insurance. The other thing you need to know is that I have a pool. My own pool. Not the HOA's pool. Mine. It's a custom saltwater lap pool that I had installed in the backyard about 2 years after moving in. It is heated, it is beautiful, and it is the single greatest purchase I have ever made. I swim laps in it 4 mornings a week. I have never once used the community pool, not because I have anything against it, but because I have no reason to. Why would I drive to a pool shared by hundreds of families when I can walk out my back door in the morning? So when the new HOA president took over at the start of the year and the board announced a special assessment for a pool renovation, I was mildly annoyed but not particularly worried. I figured this was a Phase 1 issue and would have nothing to do with me. I was wrong about one part of that. About 3 weeks into the new year, I got a notice on my door. It was a bill. $2,500. The board was calling it a luxury pool upcharge, a special assessment to fund an extensive renovation of the community pool that would include new tiling, updated filtration systems, and according to the notice, materials the new president had personally selected on a design trip. The notice said payment was due within 30 days or a lien would be filed against my property. I want to be clear that my first reaction was to assume this was a mistake. I genuinely believed someone had included my street in the mailing by accident, so I sent a polite note to the HOA management email explaining that I was in Phase 2, not Phase 1, and therefore was not part of the amenities group and should not be receiving this assessment. The response I got back was not what I expected. The new president, who I'll just call the president because that's what she was, replied personally. The tone of her message was not the tone of someone who had reviewed the documents and found an error. The tone was someone who had already decided I was going to pay and was mildly irritated that I was making her explain herself. She said that all residents of the neighborhood benefit from the presence of a world-class amenity. She said that property values for everyone go up when the community looks luxurious. She said that the improved pool would create a rising tide for the entire development. Then she said that if I did not pay by Friday, the board would move forward with placing a lien on my home. I read that reply a couple of times. I remember thinking that the phrase rising tide was an interesting choice for a pool conversation, but more importantly, I thought about what she had not done, which was address the actual question I had asked. She had not said, "You're right, you're in Phase 2, this was a mistake." She had not said, "Let me look into this." She had just informed me I was paying and considered the matter closed. I got out my house Bible, I pulled the master declaration, the recorded plat map, the deed, the original covenants, and the amendment that created Phase 2. I laid them all out and spent an evening going through them, and everything I remembered was exactly as I had remembered it. My lot number was specifically listed in the Phase 2 exhibit. The Phase 2 section explicitly stated that residents were responsible for Phase 2 landscaping assessments only. There was a clause that said Phase 2 residents were not members of the Phase 1 amenities group and were not eligible to vote on amenities decisions or be assessed for amenities costs. This was not ambiguous. This was not a gray area. This was a documented, recorded, legally filed limitation on what the HOA could charge me. I decided to attend the next board meeting. Now, I had been to board meetings before, maybe twice in 4 years, and both times were quick, uneventful, and resolved in under an hour. I did not expect what I walked into this time. The room was fuller than I had ever seen it. There were maybe 60 residents there, which for a neighborhood HOA meeting is practically a full house. There was a table at the front where the board sat, and the president was at the center of it. She was in her mid-50s, very put together, the kind of person whose living room looks like a Pinterest board. Lots of decorative signs, positive vibes, very warm until the moment you disagreed with her, at which point the warmth went somewhere else entirely. I sat near the back and waited for the open comment period. When my turn came, I kept it simple. I introduced myself by my lot number and my street. I said I had received the special assessment notice and wanted to raise a concern about whether Phase 2 residents were properly included under the scope of that assessment. I asked whether the board could show me the amenities access agreement for my specific lot. The president didn't even look at the documents I was holding up. She told the room that the special assessment applied to all residents because all residents benefit from a well-maintained, beautiful community. She said some people might not see the big picture and might focus on technicalities instead of community spirit. She said, with a tone that made it very clear she was talking about me specifically, that being frugal is understandable but that we all have to chip in for collective beauty. She said the documents I was holding were probably outdated paperwork that didn't reflect the current operating reality of the association. A few people nodded, a few people looked uncomfortable. I sat back down and didn't say another word for the rest of the meeting. On the drive home, I made a decision. I was done explaining myself. I was going to let them dig the hole, and when it was deep enough, I was going to show them what they had been standing on. 2 weeks later, the board sent another notice. This one was titled, Notice of Intent to Lien, and it included the original $2,500 assessment plus a $50 daily fine for non-payment. According to their math, I now owed them an additional $350 in penalties on top of the original amount. Then, a few days after that, a man showed up at my door. He introduced himself as a pool system inspector and said the HOA had sent him to verify whether my property was drawing on shared water resources. He had a clipboard and a shirt with a generic company name on it that looked like it had been printed at a copy shop. I later found out he was the teenage nephew of one of the board members. I'm not sure what he was supposed to be inspecting exactly, given that my pool is entirely self-contained with its own plumbing that has nothing to do with any shared infrastructure, but I told him politely that he did not have permission to access my property and closed the door. That inspection stunt was actually what pushed me from going to let this play out to time to actually accelerate this. Because here is the thing about working in insurance. You develop a habit of looking at financial documents and asking where the money is actually going. Not where people say it is going, where it is actually going. And when the board started pushing back this hard over $2,500 from one homeowner, I started wondering why they needed it that badly. Before I did anything else, I spent a few days just watching. I paid attention to what the board was posting on the community board in the neighborhood app. The pool renovation was being marketed hard. The president had apparently put together a whole presentation about it at the prior meeting, with photos of similar renovations from other communities, a color palette, even a rendering of what the updated deck would look like. She had positioned it as her legacy project, the thing that would transform the neighborhood from nice to exceptional. There were a handful of residents who were genuinely excited about it. There were also a handful who were grumbling about the cost, but they were doing it quietly, in private conversations, not at meetings. Nobody wanted to be the person who stood up and got publicly labeled as someone who didn't care about the community. That dynamic, the social pressure to go along with whatever the president wanted, was something I thought about a lot during those weeks. It is a very effective tool. Most people will pay a bill they think is wrong rather than become the neighborhood villain who refused to chip in. Most people do not have a binder with every document from their closing, organized by category, and dated. Most people assume that if an official-looking notice shows up at their door, whoever sent it must have checked whether they were allowed to send it first. I had spent 4 years being most people. I was done with that. I submitted a formal written request, sent by certified mail, to the HOA management company. I requested 5 years of full financial records for the association, itemized by phase, including all line items showing how Phase 2 landscaping assessment funds had been allocated. I also requested a copy of the original master declaration and all recorded amendments, and I asked them to provide documentation showing any agreement that extended Phase 1 amenities billing to Phase 2 lot numbers. This is what you are legally entitled to as a member of an HOA. They have to give you the financial records. They might not want to, they might delay, but they have to. It took them 6 weeks and 2 follow-up certified letters before I got anything, and when I finally got the files, I sat down on a Saturday morning with my coffee and went through them. And this is where they made their first multi-$1,000 mistake. The financials were not clean. I am not a forensic accountant, but I've looked at enough spreadsheets in my career to recognize when numbers don't line up the way they should. What I found after a few hours of going through 5 years of records was a pattern. The Phase 2 landscaping fund had been running at a surplus for most of those years. The landscaping costs for our section were consistently lower than the dues collected. But instead of rolling that surplus into a Phase 2 reserve account, the money had been moved, transferred, according to the records, to a line item labeled Community Amenities Shared Maintenance. That line item was in the Phase 1 budget. For 3 years, Phase 2 dues, my dues, and my neighbor's dues had been quietly subsidizing the Phase 1 pool fund. Not a huge amount per household, something like $140 a year per property, but across 22 Phase 2 homes in 3 years, it added up to more than $9,000 that had been redirected away from its intended purpose. I knew something they didn't, and I was going to let them keep pushing before I showed my hand. I went back and read the Phase 2 governing documents one more time. And there, in a section on voting rights and committee membership that I hadn't paid close attention to before, I found something interesting. It said that any Phase 2 resident who is formally assessed for Phase 1 amenities costs would be automatically classified as an associate member of the Phase 1 Amenities Committee for the duration of that assessment period, with full voting rights on amenities decisions. The board had tried to bill me for the pool. By doing so, according to their own governing documents, they had given me a vote on how the pool money got spent. I had never been offered that vote. They had been denying Phase 2 residents any voice in Phase 1 decisions for years. And the moment they tried to charge me for it, they accidentally opened a door they had been keeping locked. I found a real estate attorney through a referral from a colleague. I'm not talking about a big litigation firm. I just needed someone who knew HOA law well enough to review my documents and help me put together a proper response. I paid for a 2-hour consultation. Best $400 I have ever spent. He was not dramatic about it. He went through my documents, asked me a few questions about the timeline, and then spent about 20 minutes explaining exactly what I had. He said HOA boards misapply governing documents more often than most people realize, partly because board members are not lawyers, partly because they rely on management companies who are also not lawyers, and partly because most residents never push back hard enough to expose the problem. He said the financial misallocation I had found was more serious than the pool assessment itself. One was a billing mistake. The other was a breach of fiduciary duty, which means the board had a legal obligation to manage the funds correctly and had failed to do so in a way that financially harmed the residents they were supposed to be serving. The attorney confirmed everything I had found. He said the financial transfer was, at minimum, a misallocation of designated funds and potentially a breach of fiduciary duty on the part of whoever authorized those transfers. He said the attempt to assess me for Phase 1 costs without providing Phase 1 membership rights was a clear violation of the governing documents. And he said that by formally billing me, the board had, according to their own bylaws, inadvertently extended me voting rights I had previously been denied. He helped me draft a formal demand letter, not a complaint, not a strongly worded email, a demand letter with legal citations, specific document references, and a clear outline of what the board had done and what I was requiring them to do about it. The letter asked for four things. First, immediate cessation of the special assessment and all associated fines against my property. Second, a formal acknowledgement that Phase 2 residents were not subject to Phase 1 amenities assessments. Third, an independent audit of the Phase 2 landscaping fund going back 5 years. And fourth, restitution of any Phase 2 funds that had been improperly transferred to Phase 1 accounts. The letter also noted very clearly that if the board did not respond within 21 days, we would be filing in civil court seeking damages, legal fees, and a court-ordered audit. My attorney sent it to the HOA's management company and the board directly. The response time on this one was considerably faster than 6 weeks. Within 4 days, the HOA's own attorney had apparently gotten on the phone with the board because I started getting word through neighbors that there was an emergency meeting scheduled. I wasn't invited, which was fine. I already knew what was going to happen. About 10 days after the demand letter went out, I got a call from the management company. The representative was very careful with her language, very neutral, very corporate, but the message was clear. The special assessment had been removed from my account. The fines had been reversed. The board wanted to set up a call to discuss the financial review process. I told her I was happy to discuss it at the next public board meeting. That next meeting was the most attended one the neighborhood had seen in years. I was there, sitting in the same spot I'd been in before. The president was at her table again, but she looked different. She looked like someone who had recently had a very unpleasant conversation with a lawyer. The board chair, who was not the president, opened the meeting and read a prepared statement. It said that after a review of the governing documents, the board had determined that the special pool assessment had been incorrectly applied to Phase 2 properties. The assessment was being withdrawn for all Phase 2 homeowners immediately, and no further action would be taken regarding non-payment. Then he said something that got the room quiet. He said that in the course of reviewing the assessment, certain questions had been raised about the allocation of Phase 2 fund balances over the prior 3 fiscal years, and that the board had commissioned an independent audit of all association accounts to ensure full compliance with the governing documents. The president did not say anything during this part. She was looking at the table. A neighbor from my street leaned over and whispered to me, asking if I had anything to do with this. I told him I had just asked a few questions. The audit took about 2 months to complete. I cooperated fully, provided my copies of everything, and answered every question the auditors had. The result confirmed what I had found in my own review, though with more precision. The Phase 2 landscaping fund had been tapped for $9,400 over 3 years to cover shortfalls in the Phase 1 amenities budget, including the pool maintenance costs. This transfer had not been disclosed to Phase 2 residents, had not been voted on, and was inconsistent with the designated use requirements in the governing documents. The board voted in another meeting to issue refunds to all Phase 2 homeowners for their proportional share of the misallocated funds. My refund came out to $4,200, accounting for my 3 years of overpaid dues plus a small amount of interest. I got a check. As for the pool renovation that started all of this, it never happened. The project had been started before the financial issues came to light, and there was some preliminary demolition work done at the pool area based on early contractor deposits. When the full scope of the situation became clear and the board froze non-essential spending pending the audit, the project stalled. The community pool sat in a partially demolished state for months while the board tried to figure out how to fund either the completion of the renovation or the restoration of what had already been torn up. The president had personally championed this renovation. She had selected the materials, negotiated with vendors, and presented it to the community as her signature achievement. When the project collapsed, so did her position. She resigned from the board about 6 weeks after the audit results came out. The official reason given in the board newsletter was that she was stepping down to focus on personal priorities. The actual reason, based on what filtered back through various board members who were increasingly willing to talk, was that she was facing potential personal liability for authorizing the fund transfers, and her attorney had advised her to separate herself from the board as quickly as possible. I heard she also had to write a personal check to cover part of the pool restoration costs as part of a settlement with the management company. I cannot confirm that. I just know she's no longer on the board and the pool is now fixed. The lien that had been threatened against my home was never filed. The fines were voided, the $2,500 assessment was gone, and I had a check for $4,200. I put most of it toward a new heating unit for my private pool. The old one had been running fine but was getting toward the end of its lifespan, and the upgrade has been excellent. I swim my laps every morning now in water that is exactly the temperature I want it to be, in a pool that is entirely mine, in a neighborhood where the HOA has, at least for now, learn to read a contract before sending bills to people who know how to read one back. The new board reached out a few weeks after everything settled. They asked if I would be interested in joining a Phase 2 advisory committee they were creating to ensure Phase 2 residents had proper representation in future budget discussions. I said I would think about it. My wife said I should do it. She said the House Bible clearly needed another chapter. She's probably right. A few of my Phase 2 neighbors stopped me in the driveway after the refund checks went out. A couple of them had no idea any of this had been going on until the audit notice came through. A few knew something was off but had assumed it wasn't worth fighting. One of them, who has been on the street longer than I have, told me he had raised a concern about the fee structure years ago and had been told by the previous board that it was just how it works. He seemed genuinely surprised that it had been possible to push back successfully. I told him it just required keeping the paperwork. There is actually a part of this I have not told yet, and I think it might be the most satisfying piece of all. About a week after the management company called me and said the assessment was being removed from my account, something unexpected happened. One of my Phase 2 neighbors, a guy who lives 3 houses down and who I had spoken to maybe a dozen times in 4 years, knocked on my door. He had been following the situation and had done some of his own reading after I mentioned the Phase 2 documents at the board meeting. He wanted to know whether the same protections applied to him. I told him they did. I walked him through it the same way I had worked through it myself. I showed him the relevant sections of the Master Declaration. He pulled out his own closing documents, which he had kept in a desk drawer in a slightly less organized fashion than my binder, but they were all there. His lot number was in the same Phase 2 exhibit as mine. He had been paying the full Phase 2 assessment for 6 years. He was owed more than I was. Over the next 2 weeks, that conversation spread quietly down my street. Not in a dramatic, organizing a revolt kind of way, more like the way any information travels in a small neighborhood when people start talking to each other. Someone mentioned it to someone else. People dug out their own documents. A few of them compared notes in someone's driveway one evening. By the time the audit was underway, all 22 Phase 2 households were aware of it, and most of them had submitted their own records to cooperate with the process. The total refund amount across all Phase 2 properties came out to just over $58,000. Not every household was owed the same amount, since some people had moved in more recently and some had been there longer, but the average was somewhere around $2,600 per home. A few households who had been there from the beginning of Phase 2 received checks in the $4,000 to $5,000 range. The board had to fund those refunds out of the general operating reserves, which meant Phase 1 residents were in effect absorbing the cost of paying back what their pool fund had borrowed from us. That was not a popular development on the Phase 1 side of the neighborhood. I heard about a few tense conversations between Phase 1 and Phase 2 residents at the mailbox area where our street connects to the main neighborhood. Nothing aggressive. Just the particular kind of tension that happens when people realize they have been living next to a problem for years and nobody told them. The president did not take any of this quietly behind the scenes, even if she had gone silent at the public meetings. I know from a few board members who became more open over time that she spent several weeks trying to reframe the situation internally, arguing that the fund transfers had been a reasonable administrative decision made in good faith and that she should not be held personally responsible. Her position was that the Phase 2 surplus was just sitting there and the pool needed maintenance and it was a pragmatic solution to a real operational problem. The issue with that argument is that it ignored the part where she was the one who had pushed hardest to charge Phase 2 residents for the pool renovation, which means she knew, at some level, that Phase 2 residents were not normally supposed to be paying into Phase 1 amenities. You cannot simultaneously argue that taking Phase 2 money for Phase 1 expenses was a reasonable administrative decision and also argue that Phase 2 residents should pay for Phase 1 renovations because they benefit from Phase 1 amenities. Those two positions contradict each other, and the HOA's own attorney apparently pointed that out to her in terms that did not leave much room for interpretation. She submitted her resignation letter to the board chair on a Thursday evening. I found out about it on a Friday morning because another board member texted my neighbor neighbor who told me across the fence while I was doing yard work. The letter reportedly cited a desire to focus on family and a belief that the neighborhood would benefit from fresh leadership. It did not mention the audit. It did not mention the refunds. It did not mention the partially demolished pool sitting behind a chain-link construction fence in the Phase 1 common area. That pool situation was its own separate ongoing disaster that I was watching from the outside with a mixture of genuine sympathy for the residents who used it and honest admission that I felt some satisfaction about the sequence of events that had led to it. The renovation contractor had been paid a deposit, had mobilized equipment, and had removed the original pool decking and a section of the old coping before the board froze the project. At that point, the contractor was in a standoff with the board over whether the remaining balance would be paid, the board was in a standoff with its own reserves over where the money would come from, and the residents were in a standoff with everyone over why they had a hole in the ground where their pool used to be. It took about 4 months to sort out. The contractor eventually agreed to a reduced scope that the board could fund from what was left in the Phase 1 reserves after the Phase 2 refunds went out. The pool that reopened looked better than the original, the coping and decking got replaced, the filtration system got an upgrade, but it was not the Italian marble showcase the president had promised. It was a nice community pool, a normal community pool, exactly what the budget could actually support. I attended the reopening event mostly because my wife wanted to go and see the neighborhood. We walked over together on a Saturday afternoon, stood at the edge of the deck for a few minutes, made some small talk with a few neighbors we recognized, and walked back home. It was fine. It was a pool. People were swimming in it. Kids were happy. My wife pointed out on the way back that the HOA had installed a small sign near the entrance listing the renovation sponsors, which was a group of Phase 1 residents who had voluntarily contributed extra to help bridge the funding gap after the reserves took the hit. She said it was actually kinda nice that the community had pulled together to get it done. I agreed that it was. When we got home, I went out back and swam my usual laps. The new heater was running perfectly. The water was exactly the temperature I set it to. There was no one else there, no wait for a lane, no shared floaties, no question of who was responsible for the maintenance. Just me and a well-documented piece of property that I own outright and that the HOA has no jurisdiction over. I did eventually agree to join the Phase 2 Advisory Committee. My wife was right that it made sense. The first meeting was reasonable. The new board members were genuinely trying to understand how the phase structure worked and what their actual obligations were to each section. One of them admitted that before all of this, he had not realized there was a formal documented distinction between Phase 1 and Phase 2 and had assumed it was mostly informal history. I told him the formal documented distinction was the entire thing, that the paperwork is what makes it real, regardless of what anyone assumes or remembers or wants to be true. He wrote that down. I took that as a good sign. The story ends where it started, I suppose. Me in my backyard in my pool on a Tuesday morning before work. The neighborhood is quiet. The HOA has new board members who seem, at least for now, interested in actually following the governing documents. The community pool is fully repaired and operational. Phase 2 residents are no longer being asked to pay for it. And somewhere in my home office, the House Bible has a new tab in it. Behind the deed and the plat map and the original covenants, there is now a section for the audit report, the demand letter, the board minutes from the meeting where they withdrew the assessment, and the copy of the refund check. I went for a swim in my own pool, enjoying the silence of a neighborhood where the HOA finally learned how to read a contract. Stay hydrated, friends. The next one is a malicious compliance story. This story starts 3 years ago when a new line manager arrived at our office. I work in a big institution, and I knew this person from before. I was very happy when she arrived, as she is a pragmatic person that triggers virtuous mechanisms to improve our work environment. After the first 6 months, she started demanding more, imposing more work. Sometimes activities to show we are good were prioritized compared to technical ones. I started working under constant pressure without seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. The more I was doing, the more I was required to do. I was kind of complaining about it, and she told me, "It is your responsibility to tell me when it is too much to handle. I ask you because you deliver high-quality outputs, but if you want, I can ask someone else. But you know, I know you, and you need a little push to work." For me, that I am a hard worker with a good career and the respect from all the institution, I saw all this as putting the blame on me, gaslighting at its best. Here the malicious compliance started. She gave me an unreasonable deadline to write manual to use a fully functioning automatically updated dashboard produced by me from scratch. BTW prepared in 2 weeks when colleagues didn't do any progress in months. The deadline was given in the morning for the evening, in a day in which she organized an aperitivo party at one place next to our office. I told her it was not possible, but no reasons. You have to do it. I decided to work on the manual, to go to the party, and when it was over, instead of going home like everybody, I sat at my desk and started finalizing the document, making sure she knew that I was there at 8:30 p.m. She saw me, and she told me that I have a family, that I should go home, and that the manual could have been finalized the day after. I replied that I already told her she was unreasonable, but she didn't listen to me, so she now would have had the manual done before midnight, and I did it. The day after, she called me in her office saying that it was unnecessary to work till late and that I need to take care of myself and my family more. I replied that I told her no, but she wasn't accepting this, and this is the result, thanks to her. So she sent me to a mental coach to learn how to have a proper work-life balance. The coach analyzed my situation and she immediately understood that I was fine. So she asked for a meeting with me and my line manager. And hear the surprise. My LM told the coach that pushing people to do better is the only way to improve as a person. And the coach asked, "So you are not satisfied with his work?" And the LM started saying that I was the best of the whole office. The following meeting with the coach was her saying, "What a piece of crap your LM is. You don't need work-life balance sessions, you need how to put boundaries sessions." 8 sessions to work on real and hypothetical work situations, to literally learn how to repeat what she was saying to me in a way that looked wrong. And then the opportunity came on a silver plate. She asked me, in a unit meeting with all colleagues present, in a period of high workload of routine activities, to proceed with 2 new projects. I replied, "If I understand correctly, you want me to do this and that when we have to carry out mandatory task A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. Okay, no worries. I can do your new tasks, with deadline in 6 months. Forget I am going to do it before, as I have to maintain high-quality standards and a work-life balance. Take it or leave it." Once in the corner, she had to accept my calendar. She tried to push her agenda a couple of times, but I always reminded her the agreement we had in the past. From that moment, she started not assigning me extra work, at least not without asking me what I was doing, how was my workload, how much time would the new activity take, etc., etc. After 1 year, right now, I am working on a project she even doesn't know I am doing it. I am doing what is really needed, with my times, and not all the crap she wanted me to do. She cannot complain as my optimizations and efficiency gains projects are real, and I gained back my life. Thanks LM for the mental coach you asked the institution to pay for me. You wanted her to make me work at your pace. She taught me how to stop you. Kiss, kiss. Anyway, thank you for watching.